In the cold grey expanse of the South Atlantic, a warship dies not with a roar but with a sudden violent whisper. For the 281 men aboard HMS Sheffield on May 4th, 1982, the day had dawned like any other in the war zone. A monotonous cycle of vigilance and boredom, punctuated by the biting sea wind. They were a steel-grey ghost on a steel-grey sea, part of a picket line of destroyers. The electronic eyes and ears for the priceless heart of the British fleet, the aircraft carriers Hermes and Invincible, which sailed over the horizon behind them. The crew was at defense watches, a relaxed state of readiness. The threat, they believed, was hours away, far beyond the reach of Argentina's land-based aircraft. They were wrong. The lethal mathematics of modern warfare were about to be recalculated in fire and twisted metal. On the bridge, the first sign of trouble was a flicker on a screen, a radar contact so faint, so fleeting, it was initially dismissed as a phantom, a glitch in the system. But it was no ghost. It was an Argentinian Super Étendard strike fighter, flying so low it was practically tasting the salt spray, a fleeting shadow against the churning waves. And from its belly, the jet had already delivered its 5-inch sea-skimming business card, a French-made Aerospatiale AM-39 Exocet missile. It was a weapon that had never been fired in anger before this war, a technological terror whose name translated with chilling poetry to flying fish. The missile didn't need a homing beacon. It had its own brain, a small radar in its nose, which it activated only in the final moments of its flight, making it almost impossible to detect, let alone stop. It flew at over 600 miles an hour, just a few feet above the water, a sliver of hypersonic death. By the time lookouts on the Sheffield's bridge saw it with their own eyes, a tiny dark shape growing impossibly fast, it was less than 5 seconds from impact. There was no time to launch chaff, no time to engage defensive systems, no time for anything but a single desperate shout over the ship's tannoy. "Take cover!" The Exocet did not explode on the outer hull. It simply punched through the thin steel skin of the ship, 2 decks above the waterline, its sheer kinetic energy carrying it deep into the vessel's core. The impact itself was described by survivors not as a deafening blast, but as a dull, sickening thud, a brutal collision that shook the 4,000-ton destroyer from bow to stern. The missile's unspent rocket fuel, a volatile liquid inferno, ignited instantly. It scythed through the galley, where men were preparing for the next meal, and into the forward engine room, severing main power lines and water mains in a single catastrophic instant. A fireball of toxic, acrid smoke erupted through the center of the ship, plunging the interior into a black, choking hell. The lights went out, communications died. Within 60 seconds, the HMS Sheffield was a dead ship, burning furiously, adrift and powerless in the middle of the ocean. 20 men were dead or dying. The war for Britain had just changed forever. To understand how a single missile striking a single ship could threaten to unravel an entire military campaign, an act of national will 8,000 miles from home, one must look back to the political storm that had gathered just weeks before. The Falkland Islands, or Las Malvinas as they are known in Argentina, are a remote, windswept archipelago of peat and rock, home to fewer than 2,000 people, mostly shepherds of British descent. For over a century and a half, they had been a forgotten colonial remnant, a tiny speck of red on the world map, a source of a long-simmering but largely diplomatic territorial dispute with Argentina. But in early 1982, Argentina was a nation in crisis. It was in the grip of a brutal military dictatorship, a junta led by General Leopoldo Galtieri. The regime was floundering. The economy was in freefall, inflation was rampant, and the government's horrific human rights abuses, the thousands of disappeared citizens, were drawing international condemnation and fueling domestic unrest. Galtieri needed a distraction, a grand unifying cause that would wrap his failing government in the flag of patriotic fervor. He found it in the Malvinas. The islands were a deeply ingrained part of the Argentine national identity, their recovery a sacred promise taught to every school child. Galtieri and his fellow generals made a colossal gamble. They believed that Great Britain, the once mighty empire, was now a shadow of its former self, a nation in decline that had lost its nerve. They calculated that if they seized the islands, the British would protest. They would complain at the United Nations. But they would not, they could not, fight a war at the very bottom of the world to reclaim them. On April 2, 1982, Argentine forces invaded the Falklands. The tiny garrison of Royal Marines was quickly overwhelmed. The Union Jack was lowered, and the Argentine flag was raised over the capital, Port Stanley. In Buenos Aires, euphoric crowds filled the Plaza de Mayo, cheering Galtieri as a national hero. In London, the news was met with shock, humiliation, and a volcanic surge of outrage. For the government of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the invasion was not just a foreign policy crisis, it was an existential threat. To accept the Argentine fait accompli would be to confirm the narrative of irreversible British decline. It was an affront that could not stand. The decision was made with stunning speed. Britain would fight, but the challenge was monumental, a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. The British had to project military power across 8,000 miles of ocean, with no friendly land bases anywhere near the islands. They had to assemble a fleet, a task force from whatever was available. It was a splendid anachronism, a fleet that looked like something from a history book. Warships were pulled from NATO exercises. Decommissioned vessels were hastily brought back to life. Civilian ships were requisitioned from trade routes. The luxury liner Queen Elizabeth II and the cruise ship Canberra became troop transports, their ballrooms converted into barracks. Container ships and oil tankers were fitted with helicopter pads and replenishment gear. In a matter of days, this motley armada steamed south, a symbol of defiant national will, sailing towards the Antarctic winter and an uncertain war. The entire British strategy rested on a single fragile pillar: control of the air and sea around the Falklands. Without it, they could never hope to land their ground forces, let alone support them. And that control depended entirely on two ships, the aircraft carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. These two vessels, carrying a small force of Sea Harrier jets, were the only air power Britain had. They were the queen bees of the fleet, the floating airfields from which the entire campaign would be run. Every other ship in the task force, every destroyer and frigate had one overriding paramount mission: to protect those carriers at all costs. They formed a defensive screen, a layered shield of radar, missiles and guns to keep the Argentine Air Force at bay. The sinking of the Sheffield shattered that shield. It proved in the most terrifying way imaginable that the Argentine military possessed a weapon that could bypass the fleet's defenses and strike at its heart. The Exocet was a carrier killer. The British had anti-missile systems, but they were unproven, and the missile's low, fast attack profile made it a wickedly difficult target. Suddenly, the brutal calculus of the war was laid bare. Argentina didn't need to sink the entire British fleet. They only needed to get lucky once or twice. They only needed to land one or two Exocets on the flight deck of Hermes or Invincible. If they could do that, the war was over. The Sea Harriers would have nowhere to land. The troops ashore would be cut off, without air cover or supplies. Britain would face a catastrophic, humiliating defeat. The loss of the Sheffield was not just the loss of a ship and 20 brave men. It was a proof of concept. It was a warning that sent a shockwave of cold fear through the British command. Their entire strategy, their entire war effort, was balanced on a knife's edge and was now vulnerable to a 5-inch flying fish. The missile that struck the Sheffield did more than tear a hole in a ship. It tore a hole in the very logic of British naval doctrine. The threat was no longer a Soviet bomber stream coming over the North Cape, the scenario for which these ships were designed and their crews were trained. The threat was a single sea-skimming 5-meter-long projectile launched from an aircraft barely visible on radar. To counter this, the entire task force had to transform itself from a hunter-killer group into a fortress. A mobile, floating, fuel-guzzling fortress whose keep was the two carriers. And the architecture of this fortress was not built of steel and explosives but of logistics. It was an engineering problem of a scale not seen since the Second World War. The distance from the United Kingdom to the Falkland Islands is nearly 8,000 miles. A modern warship, a Type 42 destroyer like the Sheffield, consumes fuel at a staggering rate. At a cruising speed of 18 knots, its 2 Rolls-Royce Olympus TM3B gas turbines and 2 Rolls-Royce Tyne RM1C cruise turbines would burn through roughly 85 tons of diesel fuel every single day. But in a combat zone, ships don't cruise. They sprint. They maneuver at flank speed 30 knots or more to evade submarines, to reposition for air defense, to launch and recover aircraft. At that speed, fuel consumption doesn't double. It increases exponentially, potentially exceeding 400 tons per day. For the entire task force of over 100 vessels, the daily fuel requirement was measured in the thousands of tons. And that was just the fuel to move the ships. It did not include the AVCAT, the aviation turbine fuel, required by the Sea Harriers and helicopters. A single Harrier on a combat air patrol could burn through nearly 2 tons of fuel in an hour. With dozens of sorties being flown every day, the carrier's own thirst for AVCAT was relentless. This entire 8,000-mile lifeline hinged on a single desolate speck of volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic, Ascension Island. A British overseas territory, home to a few hundred people and a BBC relay station, Ascension became, overnight, the most vital military base on the planet. Its single runway at Wide Awake Airfield, built by American engineers, was suddenly handling more air traffic than London's Heathrow. RAF Hercules C-130s and Victor K-2 tankers began an air bridge, a constant stream of aircraft flying the 4,000 miles from Britain. Each Hercules could carry around 20 tons of cargo. This was not enough for the heavy essentials, the ammunition, the fuel, the bulk food. Those had to come by sea. Instead, the Hercules carried the irreplaceable, the high value, the desperately needed. They carried spare circuit boards for the Type 965 radar systems, replacement compressor blades for Harrier Pegasus engines, advanced Sidewinder AEM-9L air-to-air missiles, and perhaps, most importantly, mail from home. The heavy lifting was done by a hastily assembled fleet of civilian ships taken up from trade, or stuffed, as the military jargon had it. The superliner Queen Elizabeth II, its luxury carpets covered in plywood, was converted into a troop ship. The P&O ferry Canberra became a floating barracks. But the true unsung heroes were the tankers and the supply ships of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, the RFA. Ships like the RFA Almeida and the RFA Resource were the lifeblood. They were the bridge between Ascension and the fleet. They would load up at the island, a complex and often dangerous process with no deep-water port, and then sail south into the war zone to perform the most critical and perilous maneuver of the entire campaign: replenishment at sea. Imagine 2 ships, a 20,000-ton RFA tanker and a 4,500-ton frigate, sailing side by side just 40 meters apart in the heaving grey swells of the South Atlantic. They must maintain the exact same speed, typically around 12 knots, and the exact same course. Any deviation could mean a catastrophic collision. From the tanker, lines are fired across to the frigate. Soon, heavy hawsers are connected, followed by the thick 6-inch fuel hoses of the heavy jackstay rig. While thousands of tons of furnace fuel oil and AVCAT are pumped across, another line, a light jackstay, is rigged to transfer solid stores. Pallets weighing up to 2 tons each, carrying 4 5-inch artillery shells, boxes of rations, medical supplies, spare parts, are winched across on a traveller, dangling precariously over the churning sea between the 2 hulls. This ballet of steel and rope would go on for hours, in freezing winds and driving sleet, all while the ships were inside the known range of Argentine aircraft. Every single replenishment was a moment of extreme vulnerability. The ships were locked on a straight course, unable to maneuver, their radars cluttered by the vessel alongside. They were a perfect, unmissable target. The sheer volume of material that crossed those lines is difficult to comprehend. The force comprised nearly 28,000 personnel. The standard British military field ration was calculated to provide 4,000 calories per day to sustain a soldier in harsh conditions. For the entire task force, this meant a daily requirement of over 110 million calories. This translated into literal mountains of food. A single resupply might include 50 tons of potatoes, 20 tons of flour for the ship's bakeries, 10 tons of sugar, and tens of thousands of tins of corned beef and baked beans. All of this had to be planned, sourced in the UK, shipped to Ascension, and then delivered at sea under the constant threat of attack. The same calculus applied to ammunition. A Type 42 destroyer carried just 22 Sea Dart missiles. After a few engagements, it would be toothless. A Leander-class frigate carried Sea-Cat missiles, which were proving tragically ineffective against fast jets. Its main defense was its 4.5-inch Mark 8 gun, but its magazine held a finite number of shells. Every shot fired in naval gunfire support against positions around Stanley was a shot that had to be replaced. Every Sea Harrier sortie that dropped a 1,000-pound bomb was a sortie that created a 1,000-pound logistical demand. The entire war became a brutal equation of consumption versus supply. The Argentines knew this. Their strategy, post-Sheffield, was not necessarily to sink the carriers, but to sever this logistical artery. An attack on a lightly armed RFA tanker, if successful, could be just as devastating as a direct hit on HMS Invincible. Sinking one of the big tankers could effectively ground the Harriers and immobilize the fleet, achieving victory without ever facing a warship. The fight was no longer just about defeating the enemy. It was a race against their own fuel gauges, their own ammunition counters, their own empty stomachs. It was a war of numbers, fought by engineers and quartermasters as much as by pilots and captains. A colossal, fragile machine of supply stretched to the breaking point, 8,000 miles from home. And then, on the 25th of May, that fragile machine did not just bend. It shattered. The Argentines, flying low over the waves, had been hunting the carriers, the great hearts of the fleet. But on that day, their Exocet missiles, skimming the sea like flying fish of death, found a different kind of prize, a bigger prize. It was a 15,000-ton container ship, hastily painted grey and pressed into military service. A ship with no CIWS cannons, no chaff launchers, no real defense of its own. Its name was the Atlantic Conveyor, and it was the single most important vessel in the South Atlantic. It was not a warship. It was the war itself, packed into steel containers. On its deck sat the helicopters that were supposed to carry the entire British land campaign forward. 3 massive Chinook heavy-lift helicopters, the workhorses that could move artillery guns and entire pallets of ammunition. 6 Wessex utility helicopters. Below decks, it carried the supplies for the second phase of the war, cluster bombs for the Harriers, thousands of mortar rounds, and critically, the tents and winter gear for the men who would fight on the mountains. It carried the materials to build a forward operating base, the very foundation of the land assault. When the missile struck, the fire was instantaneous and ferocious. The ship was a tinderbox of fuel, ammunition, and materiel. 12 men were lost, including its master, Captain Ian North, who was last seen fighting the flames, a hero of the merchant navy to the very end. But as the smoke billowed into the cold grey sky, visible for miles, the men ashore on the beachhead at San Carlos understood, with a dawning, sickening horror, that more than a ship had just died. The plan had died with it. The entire British strategy for a swift, mobile war had just sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. For the men of the Parachute Regiment and the Royal Marines, huddled in their shallow trenches around San Carlos water, the news filtered down not as a strategic bulletin, but as a simple, brutal order. The helicopters were gone. There would be no airlift to the high ground around Stanley. The war would be fought on foot. They would have to walk. They called it the Yomp, a piece of Royal Marine slang for a long march. But this was no training exercise on Dartmoor. This was a forced march of 56 miles across some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet, carrying the entire weight of the war on their backs. The theory of logistics was gone. The reality was now the Bergen rucksack, a canvas and metal beast weighing well over 100 pounds, sometimes 120. Inside was everything a man needed to fight and to survive. His ammunition, his rations, his entrenching tool, his water, his sleeping bag. Strapped to the outside, a 66mm anti-tank rocket or a spare barrel for a machine gun. In his hands, his rifle. This was his world now. The weight was a physical torment, pulling at the shoulders, grinding on the hips, turning leg muscles to screaming knots of fire with every step. The ground itself became the enemy. It was not a path, it was a sodden, trackless expanse of peat bog and ankle-breaking tussock grass. A man could be walking on what looked like solid earth one moment, and be up to his waist in icy black water the next. Every step was a gamble. They crossed stone runs, rivers of sharp, shifting rock that could slice through a boot and a man's foot with equal ease. And then there was the cold. It was a living thing, a constant presence that gnawed and bit and never, ever left. The wind came straight from Antarctica, a scouring, relentless gale that carried sleet and snow horizontally. The men had waterproof gear, but after days of marching through bog and rain, nothing was truly dry. At night, with the tents for a brigade of 3,000 men, now artificial reefs at the bottom of the sea, they scraped shallow shelters in the peat, what they called scrapes. They would crawl into a wet sleeping bag, inside a wet bivvy bag, and lay their heads on a wet bergen, while the frozen ground sucked the warmth from their bodies. Sleep was not rest. It was a state of shivering misery, punctuated by the chatter of their own teeth. Men would huddle together in pairs, back to back, not for comfort, but in a desperate, primal effort to share a flicker of body heat. Waking up was the worst part. The simple act of pulling on boots that had frozen solid overnight was an exercise in agony. Fingers, numb and useless as stone, fumbled with laces. The damp seeped back into every layer of clothing, and the cold started its work all over again. The 4,000 calories a day that the quartermasters had so carefully calculated became a cruel joke. Rations were cut, then cut again. A man might have one boil-in-the-bag meal for the entire day. He would heat it over a tiny hexamine stove, a pathetic block of solid fuel that sputtered and fought against the wind, his hands cupped around it, trying to coax a small flame to life. That one hot meal was the only warmth he might feel in 24 hours. The hunger was a cold stone in the gut. Men fantasized about food, not grand feasts, but simple things. A piece of toast, a hot cup of tea, a bar of chocolate. They lost weight at an alarming rate, their faces becoming gaunt and hollowed, their bodies burning muscle just to stay warm. A soldier from Thray Para remembered finding a single, half-rotten swede in an abandoned garden patch. He and his mates carved it up with their bayonets and ate it raw, and it was, he said, the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. This was the new logistics, not ships and manifests, but a shared biscuit, a last cigarette, a dry pair of socks traded for a handful of bullets. The ammunition shortage became a constant nagging fear. The vast stockpiles that went down with the conveyor meant that every round, every shell, every mortar bomb was now precious. Men who had been trained to suppress the enemy with overwhelming fire were now forced to become marksmen, picking their shots. Artillery batteries, the great killers of the battlefield, had to ration their fire. A gun crew might be told they had only 10 shells to support an entire company in an attack. 10. The pressure was immense. Every calculation had to be perfect. A miss wasn't just a wasted shell, it was a betrayal of the infantrymen whose lives depended on it. On the front lines, as they approached the mountains that ringed Stanley, the visceral reality of this logistical failure became terrifyingly clear. A mortar team from 45 Commando, preparing to assault Two Sisters, realized they had carried their heavy mortar baseplate and tube all the way across the island, only to discover they had just a handful of bombs to fire. They had become beasts of burden for a weapon they could barely use. Companies attacked heavily defended Argentine positions with less ammunition than they would use on a training exercise in Scotland. They made up for the lack of firepower with silence, with skill, with the terrifying ferocity of the bayonet. The strategy had devolved from a modern war of technology to something ancient and brutal. It was a war of legs and lungs and sheer, bloody-minded courage. The single Exocet that struck the Atlantic conveyor had not just destroyed a ship. It had stripped away the machinery of modern warfare and left the British soldier alone on the frozen hills with nothing but his rifle, the man next to him, and the will to walk into the guns. The war would be won, but it would be won at a human cost that no planner in London had ever imagined. It would be paid for in frostbite, in exhaustion, in starvation, and in blood, one agonizing footstep at a time. And so the final act began. not with a roar of engines, but with the quiet crunch of boots on frozen ground. The mountains, Two Sisters, Tumbledown, Longdon, were not just terrain features on a map. They became gods of a sort, dark and indifferent, their slopes littered with jagged rock that tore at flesh and fabric. This was the turning point, where the war's grand strategy, conceived in war rooms a world away, finally shattered against the hard reality of the land itself. The lack of helicopters, the absence of heavy artillery support, the poverty of ammunition, these were not abstract logistical problems anymore. They were the very grammar of the coming battles. The British planners had envisioned a war of maneuver, of airmobile assaults that would leapfrog enemy strongpoints. The ghost of the Atlantic conveyor forbade it. Instead, the final push for Stanley became a throwback to a different century. It was a war of infantry, a soldier's war in its most primal form. Night attacks became the only viable option, not as a clever tactic, but as a grim necessity. Under the cold, uncaring stars of the southern hemisphere, men crept forward, their faces blackened, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The silence of their approach was their greatest weapon, a cloak woven from the enemy's expectation of a deafening artillery barrage that would never come. On the slopes of Mount Longdon, the fight devolved into something medieval. It was a battle fought in pockets in the dark, with rocks for cover and the glint of a bayonet for a warning. Men fought with grenades, with fighting knives, with bare hands. The sound was not the rolling thunder of a modern battlefield, but the intimate, terrible chorus of individual combat, the grunt of effort, the sharp cry of pain, the frantic scrabbling for purchase on loose scree. A machine gun nest that would normally be silenced by a single artillery shell had to be taken by a handful of men crawling on their bellies, their lives measured in the terrifying seconds it took to pull a pin and throw true. This was the direct consequence of that single missile strike. The sophisticated web of combined arms had been torn, and the men on the ground were left to mend it with their own courage and their own blood. The strategy was no longer about overwhelming the enemy. It was about outlasting him, one rock, one trench, one man at a time. When the guns finally fell silent and the white flags appeared over Stanley, a new kind of silence descended. It was heavier, deeper than the quiet that had preceded the battles. It was a silence filled with ghosts. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of surreal ruin. The machinery of war lay scattered and broken, a testament to the suddenness of the end. Argentine helmets dropped in surrender, dotted the hillsides like strange upturned bowls. Ration packs, letters from home, tangled coils of wire, the mundane debris of a failed occupation, were left to the wind. The earth itself was wounded, pockmarked with shell craters, and stitched with the dark lines of trenches that would, for years, refuse to heal. The peat, a living blanket that holds the memory of millennia, had been torn open, exposing the pale stone beneath like scar tissue. And then there were the deeper wounds, the ones that would not close, the minefields. Thousands upon thousands of plastic anti-personnel and anti-tank mines had been scattered across the common land, the peat bogs, and the beautiful sandy beaches. They were sown in haste, often without maps, a final spiteful act of a retreating army. Unlike a trench which can be filled or a rusting vehicle which can be cleared, a mine is a patient killer. It holds its breath, waiting. The fences went up, adorned with the stark skull and crossbones, cordoning off huge swathes of the island. These beautiful, empty landscapes, once places of solitude and freedom for the islanders, became zones of permanent menace. The war had not truly ended. It had simply buried itself, leaving a venomous legacy just beneath the surface. For generations, children would be taught which beaches they could not play on, which hills they could not climb. The scars on the land became the maps of their lives, a constant physical reminder of a violence that had come from over the horizon and refused to completely leave. Looking back, the story of the Atlantic conveyor is more than a tale of a single devastating loss. It is a parable about the fragility of modern power. We build systems of immense complexity, logistical chains that stretch across oceans, strategies that rely on the perfect synchronization of 1,000 moving parts. We believe we have tamed the chaos of war with technology, with planning, with overwhelming force. And then a single 5-meter missile, a flicker of heat on a radar screen, unravels it all. It proved that the entire edifice of a modern military campaign could be balanced on the knife's edge of a single ship's hull. The strategy was broken, but the war was won. It was won by the soldier, the man on the ground who was forced to adapt, to carry the weight, to walk the miles, to fight in the dark. It was won because when the technology failed, the human spirit did not. But that victory came at a cost, written not just in casualty lists, but in the enduring memory of the land and its people. The Falklands are quiet now. The wind still blows across the empty hills, whispering through the shattered rock of Tumbledown and whistling through the rusting wire fences that guard the minefields. It is a land that holds its story close, the story of how a plan, an entire modern strategy, was sunk by one missile, and how a war thought to be about machines was ultimately decided by the enduring, agonizing, and undeniable strength of human will.